Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. Did you enjoy those summer solutions? Yeah, I know I did. Well, it's time to get back into the problems. So let's turn to Stacy.
Right. Well, the Fed had better hope the solution to inflation is just time, because remember, they keep on saying it is transitory. Well, their usual solution is giving more and more money. The Treasury is always giving more and more money, Congress more and more money. So we're going to look at what some of the results that have come out while we've been gone for the past 2 weeks. We've seen not only inflation numbers hit over 5%, the highest in a very long time since 2008, but container freight rate spike to new extremes, up 500% for Asia, US, Asia, EU since early 2020. And the worst is still ahead. And Wolf Richter uses a quote from Jerome Powell just under this. It turns out it's a heck of a lot easier to create demand than it is to bring supply up to snuff. So we'll go over some of the details on these rates, but they're pretty shocking, Max.
Right, yeah, that's a good comment by Wolf Richter about demand. It's always spoken about in Keynesian economics corners that they need to stimulate demand by printing money. But we live in an age now where the supply side of the equation is broken. So we're entering into these supply shocks, whether it could be microchips, for example, or basic commodities are up sharply. There's a food insecurity now by hundreds of millions of people around the world just emerging over the past 12 months because of this runaway inflation, because of the runaway money printing, as we've been saying for a few years. So now people are really coming to grips with the fact that, yeah, Keiser Report's been right about it. What's next?
Right. So we'll go over some of the data. The important one to look at there in terms of the container freight rates is from Shanghai to Los Angeles. And so think about this. Everybody got a lot of stimulus checks. We covered this. Thousands and thousands of dollars over the past year, a year and 2 months. And what they did is they bought durable goods. They bought refrigerators. They bought washing machines. And where did it all come from? It came from China. So this is the most important one for this COVID lockdown story and the supply shortages and rates spiking. Average port-to-port spot rates from Shanghai to Los Angeles soared from around $1,500 per 40-foot container in early 2020, and from a 5-year average of $2,177 to $4,000 in September of 2020, to $8,000 in June of 2021, and $9,631 in the week ending July 8th, according to Drury Supply Chain Advisors. This would be an increase of over 500% from early 2020.
You see, there's two things that have been going on for the last 20 years. Number one, money printing. Number two, China enters global economy. And all that money printing went over to China along with American jobs, but the American consumer didn't notice that because the price of stuff coming in from China, like those white goods, the washers, the dryers, the TV screens, the clothes, was dropping precipitously, a lot cheaper. Well, at some point, as you pour water into a bucket, at some point the bucket is full and then the water starts to spill over. So here we have a situation where all the cheap gains that have accrued due to including China into the World Trade Organization under Bill Clinton have exhausted themselves. So all the money printing, like that water into the bucket, is now spilling over as real inflation. But I think the reason this has caught people off guard is that it took 20, 25 years to fill that bucket because bringing China on, as Bill Clinton did, was really a remarkable situation of putting 500 million workers making virtual slave labor into this globalized economy that was all hooked up through the internet. And we just had an amazing crash in the logistics prices and delivery prices. And remember, it was only 2 or 3 years ago, we were saying the price of these containers, the Baltic Dry Index, if you recall, on this very show, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, we would all say, oh my God, it's hitting new crash lows. It's so low, it's so low. But now it's all been essentially equalized or normalized. So the money printing is now going to hurt really badly.
The past 20 years, part of the reason why I didn't catch up was that there was a lot of money printing, but it was all credit. It came from the central bank cutting rates ever lower, taking those assets off the balance sheets of the banks and putting it onto the central bank's balance sheet. The past year, we've seen thousands and thousands of dollars sent to every single individual American. We saw those PPP forgivable loans, tens of billions of dollars given to small businesses. This is real money. It's filtered straight into the economy and without a commensurate, of course, goods and services being provided here. So that's why you're starting to see the inflation, because everybody's spending it, but the only place to spend it is in China. And the volume is quite remarkable. So what you see is the Port of Los Angeles has been setting records in terms of the volume of imported loaded containers. The container volume is expressed in the standard measuring unit of TEU, which stands for 20-foot equivalent unit, where a 40-foot container contains 2 TEUs. For the 5 months from January through May, the port imported 2.37 million TEU in loaded containers, according to data from the Port of Los Angeles. This was up from 26% from the prior record period of January through May of 2017. So it set a new record high by 26% of the previous record high. You can see the parabolic move. It all started exactly, all of this data started exactly once the first stimulus checks started to pour into American coffers. So it is causing some inflation, is causing some friction as well, because of course you're starting to see headlines suggesting that it's China that's causing inflation, or you see signs that it's Bitcoin causing hyperinflation.
Right. Well, interesting. Those two being brought up in that context. Look, China's GDP is up like 18%, and the U.S. is barely positive. And why? Because China is trying to grow their economy. If you're trying to grow your economy based on manufacturing stuff and selling it, you're going to end up with people working, manufacturing stuff, and selling it. If you have an economy based on social justice warriors who are begging for more stimulus checks so they can give it all to China, your GDP is not going to go up because you're not manufacturing stuff to sell to Chinese people or anyone else in the world.
Well, you're definitely going to see, because we haven't seen this in our entire adult lifetimes. We had this in our childhood of the inflation, and it causes a lot of friction. It causes tension because you're flush with money. You're getting a lot of money put in your bank account. You can't deny that there was tens of thousands of dollars put into average households, savings accounts, and they're feeling good and they want to go out and spend it. The problem is everybody else feels the same and everybody else is doing the same. And there's only so many goods and services for people to buy. So you're also seeing that in the next headline about how much rent inflation is going up. And rent is an important component of the CPI index, right? Well, rent prices are soaring as Americans flock back to cities. Nationwide, rent prices are up 7.5% so far this year to date, 2021, 3 times higher than normal. According to data from apartments.com, analysts expect rent prices to keep climbing for the foreseeable future, a major burden for renters and a warning sign that higher inflation could linger far longer than the White House and Federal Reserve keep predicting.
Right, the old pea and shell game. You have a pea and you have 3 shells, and you're like, oh, where's the pea? Where's the pea? Well, the Bureau of Labor Statistics in Washington, D.C. have been playing this game for 40 years, 50 years, where every year, every 2 years, they have a new definition of how to calculate inflation, right? They substitute hamburger for steak. They say a computer is twice as fast, so it's half as cheap. They substitute rent for houses. But eventually, instead of having 1 pea to play with in the shell game, it's now 3 peas. And every single shell you turn over, it's inflation, inflation, and guess what? Inflation. So all those hedonic adjustments and all that gamesmanship that's been going on to help the Federal Reserve keep rates low so that the investment bankers and the private equity firms have cheapest possible money to buy other companies for virtually nothing has come to an abrupt end in the form of people starving. So now the equation is really cruel because for every new billionaire, you can make a direct link to X number of starving people, full stop.
So yeah, in the United States, a lot of people have, like I said, over $10,000 in their savings account. They haven't spent it in the past year. They're ready to start spending it. They want it. They're like, hey, I have 10,000. That's enough for a deposit to move to a new town, to move to a new city, start again. So flush with cash. Well, everybody's doing the same exact thing. And they're all heading to these cities like Boise, Idaho. They're heading to Sacramento, to other like smaller cities, not New York, not San Francisco. And you're seeing the rents soar. You're seeing it in Phoenix. This headline here from this quote here, Jason Giroux, owner of 410 Real Estate in Phoenix, said he has managed rentals for nearly 15 years and never seen anything like this. His rental listings are often getting more than a dozen applications. People call him and offer to pay more than the asking price for the rental, effectively creating bidding wars on rental properties. On 2 recent listings, so many people offered to pay more money that he had all the applicants write down their best offer.
Right. Notice it's about renting and not buying, because one of the fallouts from the COVID crisis has been the private equity groups like Warren Buffett and others buying thousands and hundreds of thousands of properties and putting them out of reach for buyers. And now their only recourse is to rent. And now we're seeing rents rise, but of course, they can't afford to buy houses anymore. So you end up with essentially what would become a hut on the company store on the consumer plantation known as America.
Right. Well, you're going to be talking to Rick Ackerman, who believes deflation is the biggest story. But I don't think it's a consolation at the end of the day. It's like you could say, hey, the good news is there's 5 trillion or quadrillion in bad debts over here. And that's deflationary. It's going to cause an economic crisis. But your rent is still going up. Your healthcare is still going up. Freight costs are still going up. All your goods and services are going up in price at the end of the day.
I really want to know what Rick Ackerman has to say about all this. Don't go away. Much more coming your way. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to return to the legendary Rick Ackerman of Rick's Picks. Rick, welcome back.
Thanks much for inviting me on, Max.
I'm looking at today's New York Post on the front page. Huge headline, the incredible shrinking dollar. It's talking about inflation. It's talking about prices skyrocketing. So let's talk about this inflation versus deflation debate yet again. First of all, why do so many people don't seem to understand these two words, inflation versus deflation? Why is there such confusion? Is it obfuscation for a purpose, or are people just massively ignorant on the topic? Why do we always have trouble with these two words?
I think because you symptomatically have both things going on at the same time sometimes, but also, the monetarists sort of set the agenda for inflation. They said that inflation was simply an increase in the supply of money. But I would submit that there are so many fungible forms of money anymore that you really can't measure it. I always suggest that you look at inflation or deflation in terms of the chief symptom, which is for deflation, it's an increase in the real burden of debt, meaning that whatever you owe is going to be paid back in dollars that are increasingly dear. And of course, inflation is an opportunity for borrowers to pay back what they owe in cheapened dollars. So I think if you want to understand inflation and deflation, just ask yourself, for one, has my mortgage burden gotten harder or lighter?
Okay, so you're saying a couple things there. First of all, just the supply of money is not necessarily a good gauge when you're talking about inflation, because there are so many different types of money now. It's that it's impossible to totally get a handle on this. And one index that seems to be really the telltale index would be the dollar. So the dollar is showing a lot of strength recently, and so that plays into this deflation theme. And but nevertheless, you've got CPI at 5.4%, rents up 7.5%, freight container rates are up 500%, and to get back to what you were saying there, you got two things going on at the same time. You've got destruction in the capital markets or destruction in the bond markets. That's deflation. But you've got all this money supply. What about the average person out there? I mean, the average person, they're experiencing inflation. So shouldn't that be the primary thing people are talking about, or what am I missing?
Well, let me mention one thing. As far as destruction of the capital markets, it's inflation that does that. Deflation more or less leaves the system itself intact because essentially the borrowers haven't been screwed. The deflation visits pain on borrowers. The lenders haven't gotten screwed. As far as what's going on now, you can see that conflict between inflationary forces and deflationary. Let's just take the renters that you mentioned for one. They've all been subsidized for quite a while. It works out to be sort of a transfer payment to landlords that they've received from the government. But we're running up against, I think it's a July 31st threshold on the non-eviction clause in one of the stimulus bills. And if all of let's just take the extreme example where these checks that have subsidized rents for so long stop flowing. So that's going to put a squeeze on the landlords. They have their own borrowing, their own mortgages to pay. And that's really deflationary. There's no question, though, that if you go out shopping, pretty much everything is that the prices are insane. But we've never really made a distinction between whatever kind of inflation we're having now and the one in the 70s. It was driven by a wage spiral, but right now we have inflation driven by an asset explosion. And that's why they're very different. The 70s inflation was, let's call it organic. It had a push and pull factor, and wages pushed prices up, which in turn pushed wages up. But now most of the inflation doesn't come from that kind of slow acting dynamic. It's really coming from an asset inflation that could collapse any time. If you have a bear market in stocks, you're going to be deflating like crazy.
To follow up on a point that you just made, and one that a mistake that I make often. So, in other words, destruction of capital is really associated with inflation because you're increasing all this money and you're destroying the purchasing power, et cetera. Whereas deflation, as you're pointing out here, is an attempt to preserve the system as it is. And so this is why when banks are about to default on their debts, the federal government just comes in and does some quantitative easing. They take all that bad debt off their balance sheets and they replace it with some new, fresh treasury bills. So they're not allowing the system to cleanse itself of all the malinvestments that may or may not have occurred. They're keeping a system afloat that is not worthy to be kept afloat because of all of the terrible price signals that are going on. Therefore, my conclusion is that the deflation or preservation of the system, as we're seeing it now, that's a political act, right? So there's a political dimension to this economic problem. It's not capitalism. It's a political problem. Is that a fair statement?
Well, it is. It's not even really much of a decision. We're really at the point of inflate or die right now, and we've been sort of fending off deflation for 2 decades, and we're not sort of standing still in that process. The more, whenever you defend inflation, whenever you try to hold the line against that deflationary juggernaut that's waiting to implode, you're essentially using borrowing as the mechanism. And so we've had a lot of money borrowed into the system at a given fixed interest rate. And I mean fixed in a couple ways, or mainly in the way that gamblers fix horse races. So we really can't afford to have interest rates uptick, because it will subject literally quadrillions of dollars of borrowing that have been done on planet Earth, a lot of it through the derivatives market, to a somewhat higher rate of interest, and that would be crushing. But I think the effort is doomed to fail simply because the key here is the real rate of interest. And when I mentioned the burden on debtors earlier, that's what I meant to imply. In 2007 and 8, when the housing market collapsed, people who had what were historically low mortgages were crushed, really, because the value of the underlying asset was shrinking. So if we've got interest rates jerry-rigged down to 1 or 2%, that can still become a crushing burden if the collateral that's behind it is shrinking in value.
Let's look at the 10-year Treasury for a second. It's at 1.4%. Inflation is running at a stated rate of 5.4%. So, how much longer are folks willing to hold these Treasury bonds? I mean, that seems to be the linchpin of the whole system. If there's still support in the Treasury market, they can keep this thing going. But how much longer is that going to last, do you think, Rick?
From a technical standpoint, if you look at the very long-term chart of the 10-year and the 30-year, we're really in a corrective phase. It feels like a bear market where interest rates are going higher and bond prices are going lower. But to the extent that we've had that for a while, it looks corrective to me. On the other hand, I don't think that the current interest rates are coming down. I think they have a little further to go, but I do feel that there's going to be an upward skew in interest rates before the larger that long-term trend going back 40 years in the bonds reasserts itself with by way of higher bond prices and lower yields.
So we've got a little bit left on the bond rally. I guess the 10-year could flirt with 1%, I guess. And then that 40-year bull market in the bonds, you think, and you're essentially a timer, you're a guy who makes his bones by reading charts, and you have an excellent service over there at Rick's Picks, has an excellent track record. You think that we're approaching the end of this 40-year bond move rally, Rick?
I think it's got some room the bonds have room to rally, meaning rates can go lower. But obviously the big, the big play, the thing that made a portfolio that just stuck with bonds a huge winner was that move is over. You're really sort of squeezing out the last little piece of it, which would take rates down from 2% to, lower. And for a while, everybody was talking about negative U.S. rates. I don't really see that happening under any circumstances, but it's really mainly because the collapse is going to happen when you measure the real rate of interest. So we could have interest rates, as I mentioned earlier, down near 2 or 1%, and it would still be a crushing burden because the borrowing that took place. The value of the collateral would be falling.
We have now a situation around the world where the inflation's causing a lot of food insecurity. Millions of people are now, similar to 2008 when we had the Arab Spring and we had the financial crisis, we had the food insecurity issues contributed to revolutions and uprisings. We're on the cusp of that, seemingly. Would that have a feedback into the markets? Would the markets look at that and have any kind of impact at all, or would they just continue with the status quo, Rick?
Well, I think the big enchilada really is the energy market. Coming out of the 2007-8 great financial crash, the smart guys looked around and think, well, what can we hawk up to our eyeballs? And since housing was a non-starter at that point, real estate, they decided, well, let's hawk the oil patch. So they did, and miraculously, you see the price of crude rallying now into the mid-70s, and there's no way that that's driven by demand. It's almost like the stock market. You get a little incremental feeding into a market like AMC or GameStop, and you have a kind of short squeeze effect. So I'm not quite sure how that would be engineered in crude, but it's sort of it's a benign miracle that crude prices are so high, because that's really where a lot of the leveraging took place. You know, the global markets have been pledged against oil and energy assets to an extent where you might say we really need for these prices to be high. But I don't see the support of demand there, even from the biggest user at the margin, China.
All right. Rick Ackerman, thanks so much for being on Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max, for inviting me on.
That's going to do it for this edition of Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank our guest, Rick Ackerman of Rick's Picks. Until next time, bye, y'all.